Good morning to everyone attending this seminar, and thank you to the speakers at today's workshop for accepting our invitation. It's an honor for us to be able to host you at Eurac, even though only in a virtual format. Next time, we promise we will have an in-person meeting that will be much more, let's say, appreciated for everyone to know each other. Before I introduce today's guest, allow me a couple of words to introduce ourselves, Francisco and myself, Francisco, Javier, Romero, Caro, and myself, and a couple of words on the research project under which this workshop series has been organized and funded. So Francisco and I are senior researchers at the Institute for Comparative Federalism, which is one out of 11 institutes at Eurac Research. And in particular, at the Institute, we carry on research on several issues related to federalism. And in particular, we focus on federal, subnational, and local issues. And we put together a team of members that combine constitutional scholars and political scientists. So we approach at federal issues from this combined perspective, and very frequently we engage in interdisciplinary investigation as well. So we work also with other scholars from different disciplines having a different background. The idea is that we carry on basic research, but also applied research. We have a lot of projects ongoing on federal issues and federalism as a general topic. What is interesting to mention is that we also host research fellows from time to time, I would say rather frequently, actually, and we also have some training programs, among which I would like to mention the Winter School on Federalism and Governance, which is an annual program that takes place, I think, for more than 10 years. I think last year was the 10th anniversary or maybe the 11th edition. Among the different research foci, I would like to mention today's topic, that is fiscal federalism. So fiscal federalism is one of the focus of our institute. In particular, we adopt the same approach of the institute in general. So we investigate fiscal federalism from a constitutional law and comparative perspective. We investigate the rules entrenching fiscal constitution, we monitor ongoing reform processes and their implementation, and we pay special attention at intergovernmental institution and decision-making procedures. An interesting approach to fiscal constitution is the attention paid to how rules and institution works in practice, so the gap between law and practice. And in doing that, again, a comparative and constitutional law perspective is adopted, though contamination, especially in this field with other disciplines, are frequently present. Just to mention a few focus of investigation, a few research we carried on in this field: tax autonomy and fiscal responsibility. We developed some attempts also at measuring fiscal responsibility from a legal perspective, and we focus on constitutional asymmetries in fiscal constitution. We focus on local finance and relation with the upper levels, on the impact of European economic governance on subnational autonomy, and last but not least, on equalization mechanism as a tool of conflict management. This last issues is at the ground of the project that has funded this workshop series. The project is named with the acronym DATE, that stands for Diversity Accommodation through Territorial Equalization. The idea is that fiscal instruments have a role in accommodating diversity and to a certain extent also reducing the risk of secession. At the same time, this topic is barely explored in the literature, or better, secession is widely explored, but not from the perspective of the role of fiscal instrument in favoring or constraining such trends. So the aim of the project is to go behind the current state of the art and explore from a legal and comparative point of view the role of fiscal arrangements, and in particular of equalization mechanism, as a tool of territorial integration or disintegration. And this is done focusing on federal systems facing secession challenges. And one of the main goals of the project is to develop a set of indicators that could be used for legal comparative analysis and to measure the impact of equalization on territorial integration. What is finally to mention is that the project has been awarded the Seal of Excellence under the Marie Curie Individual Fellowship Program. And for this reason, the autonomous province of Bolzano has financed this project, has funded this project for 2 years. So now we are at the end of the project, because it will end at the beginning of October. So the idea is to have this final conference to put together a team of scholars dealing with fiscal federalism and diversity, trying to match the two topics and to add additional example to the ones that have already been investigated in the project, that are Scotland, Catalonia, and Quebec. Said this, I think it's now time to start with the presentation. And in particular, it's now time to present the first speaker of this morning. It's my pleasure to introduce Hansjörg Blöchliger. Sorry for the pronunciation, I'm not sure that it's the best one. Blöchliger will give a presentation with the title Fiscal Federalism and Diversity, an overview on intergovernmental fiscal frameworks. Blöchliger is senior economist at the economics department of OECD, and in particular until 2016, he was head of the Fiscal Federalism Network, and from 2017 onwards, he's head of the Russia and Lithuania desk. What has to be mentioned is that, among many other things, is that he has published extensively on fiscal federalism, and I would say that he has published on every possible topic related to fiscal federalism. But to mention some of interest to us, equalization and fiscal decentralization, and in particular, the innovative way he has developed to measure fiscal decentralization have been very much followed by us in our research. In fact, I personally find his research of particular interest because of his ability to convey the economic approach to scholars of other disciplines. And this is the reason why we really have the pleasure to have you here. So I think it's now time to pass the floor to our guest and for his presentation. So please, the floor is yours.
Unmute yourself first, I think.
Again, you see, whenever I'm starting doing something, the quality drops. Sorry for that. Of course, you have to unmute before you start talking. Again, thank you very much, Alice, for this very kind introduction. I'm trying to do justice to your kind words. I'm happy to see that fiscal federalism is still en vogue, is still of interest in both, let's say, the academia and in the political world, to see that that you succeeded in bringing together so many scholars, and that so many research institutes are dealing with the different aspects of fiscal federalism, fiscal decentralization, equalization, under the specific, let's say, angle of diversity accommodation, which indeed is not at the center of economists' attention, but actually should be. The OECD is a very data and indicator-driven organization. That's why I'm going to make a presentation that shows, or that tries to show, what you're interested in, or at least in a part you're interested in, namely, what are the actual intergovernmental fiscal frameworks we're talking about? What are the different fiscal equalization mechanisms countries have introduced? What are the fiscal constitutions federations, federal countries have set up to accommodate this diversity? So what I'm going to do, or what I'm trying to do, is drive you through a set of indicators that show how, especially federal countries, but not only federal countries, have chosen different intergovernmental fiscal frameworks in different fiscal institutions to accommodate their policy and political needs. So now I'm trying to share and hope that it will work. So I hope you can.
We can see it.
You can see. I just want to go to the beginning. So let me start with probably one of the most important aspects of fiscal federalism, the aspect that some theorists or theoreticians on fiscal federalism have described as the essence of federalism, namely the tax autonomy of subcentral governments, the tax autonomy or the taxing power of state and local governments, the share of the taxation that goes to state and local governments, and the institutional power those subcentral governments have over those taxes. Now, looking at the slide, you see immediately that this taxing power, that is tax autonomy, varies a lot across those countries. Even if you look at the federal countries only, so those countries where you see that that tax autonomy is composed or is set together between local and the state level, you see that even for federal countries, the tax autonomy varies greatly across those federations. Take the case of Canada, where almost 45% of tax revenues goes to the state and local level, and the Canadian provinces have a lot of power over these taxes, down to Austria, where the actual taxes that go to the state and local governments is almost nil. It's very tiny. The Austrian states are mostly financed through transfers from the central government. Now you might ask, why is this so? Why did countries choose so different fiscal arrangements? And you might link it to your own question. What has it to do with diversity accommodation? Has it to do that Canada and Austria are differently diverse, are diverse in a different sense, or that Canada has to accommodate diversity in another way than Austria? We take another example of how fiscal arrangements, intergovernmental fiscal relations, fiscal institutions vary across the countries. On the left-hand side, the left-hand panel shows a figure that sets the decentralization of spending against the decentralization of revenue. Now, put very simply, the 45 line that you see very strongly going across the figure shows a situation where revenue decentralization in a country is exactly the same as a spending decentralization. So in that country, or in that hypothetical country, the country would finance all its spending through its own taxes. Now you see immediately that it is not the case in no federation. And in many federations, in many federal countries, the spending decentralization is much, much higher than tax decentralization. Again, meaning that in most federal countries, a part of the spending of the states and the local governments is funded through intergovernmental transfers. Again, it varies a lot. You see countries that are closer to the line, like for instance, Germany, Canada, or Switzerland, especially the USA. But you also see countries which are farther away from that line, like Mexico and Australia, where most spending is financed through intergovernmental grants. Again, you might ask, why are what explains the differences in such intergovernmental fiscal frameworks? Why is the difference between spending and revenue decentralization so different across the countries? Why are some countries more financed through intergovernmental grants than others? Has it to do with what you call diversity accommodation? Do these frameworks have to deal with that? Or can the differences be explained by diversity accommodation? Are there other reasons why these differences are so large? On the right-hand side, you see the evolution of how decentralization ratios, spending and revenue decentralization evolved over the last 30 years. And you see a few interesting cases. You see especially Spain and Italy, Spain and Belgium. You also see Italy. You see that these countries are decentralized on both accounts, both on spending and revenue. And of course, you might ask, why is it especially Belgium and Spain that have gone through such a strong decentralization process? I mean, there are political explanations. We know all that Belgium and Spain have strong, let's say, centrifugal forces that push towards decentralization. So one explanation for this move toward decentralization might indeed be that those countries are dealing with or are accommodating diversity through decentralization. Now, another point, I mean, you have talked about fiscal constitutions. So going actually down to constitutional economics or constitutional law, and not only looking at public finance indicators, but really looking at the constitutions of federal countries in a comparative way. What do they tell? I mean, this is a project we did quite a few years ago. It goes back to 2014, 15, and 16. It was actually an indicator-driven exercise going into the fiscal constitution of every federation, not only for the year 2013, but going back since the creation of the federation, and looking at what do these constitutions say about intergovernmental fiscal frameworks? What do they say about spending power of the states? What do they say about the taxing power of the states? What do they say about coordination mechanisms between state and federal governments? What do they say about the role of different fiscal institutions like fiscal council or constitutional courts? What do they say about collaboration mechanisms that are enshrined in the constitution and basic law? So you see there is quite a lot of indicators that are then brought together to form one single indicator measuring the actual degree of decentralization a country has enshrined in its constitution. What you see is something that is, well, which in the end was not that surprising to us. Well, the first thing which was not surprising, but again, there are very strong differences across countries. There are countries or federal countries which are rather decentralized, like the Swiss, the Canadian, or the US one, where state governments have quite a lot of power. But there are also what we call the integrated fiscal constitutions, countries where the constitutional background, where the constitutions themselves call for strong integration of the state governments, where there is a lot of coordination between federal governments and the state governments, a lot of collaboration between state and federal governments, and many institutions that of checks and balances between the federal and the state governments. So you see there is kind of a one dimension between highly integrated fiscal constitutions to very decentralized fiscal constitutions. One thing we liked particularly was that we actually tried to draw back, or to go back to the history of those fiscal constitutions. How have the fiscal constitutions, or how has the constitutional background of these federal countries evolved over the last 100 years? We constructed what we call building blocks of five let's say, main elements of the fiscal constitution, mainly related to the autonomy, the responsibility, and the way state governments collaborate with the federal government and vice versa. And what we found out is, again, something which is not highly surprising. The autonomy of the state governments over the past 100 years in most federations declined. It was much bigger before the Second World War, and it was larger after the Second World War. However, it increased in a time when there was a lot of talk of decentralization and deregulation, which was starting in the 1980s and 1990s. You actually see that the autonomy curve is again rising during that period, but it fell again in the years 2000 and afterwards. Another point, or another building block, is what we call the co-determination, the power of state governments to shape policy at the federal government. So all the ways that they do that through the second chamber of a federation, or other ways to shape policy at the federal level. That co-determination, or that co-determination power, actually has increased. It has increased more or less regularly over the past 100 years. Today, state governments have much more power to shape policy at the federal level than they had over the past decades. Again, those building blocks, they differ across countries, across federations. Again, you might ask, what explains the overall evolution? Has it to do with diversity accommodation? And how did it evolve in the different countries? One aspect which is not directly related to the fiscal framework, but more to the economic background, or the economic pattern in a country, is the regional differences in GDP, the underlying reason for fiscal equalization. Again, you see that that regional differences vary strongly across the countries. They are rather low in some federations, like you take the case of Canada, even Spain. But they're larger in other countries, like Germany, and unfortunately I can't see it on my own slide because it's covered by the picture of the team session. But you see yourself on which countries have large differences in GDP, the regional GDP, and which countries have small differences in GDP. Now, given that the differences in regional GDP are the basis for equalization, the question then arises, well, which countries do actually have large fiscal equalization systems? Are those the countries that have large differences in GDP? Or are those the countries that somehow have to establish large equalization systems for another reason? Again, you see that fiscal equalization systems vary strongly in size across countries. You have countries like Australia and Germany, which their systems are very, very equal. They're really comparable. those two countries have really large fiscal equalization systems. In the Australian case, it's almost 10% of the budget is dedicated to equalization. On the other hand, you have countries like Belgium or Italy, where equalization actually only plays a large part in only plays a small part in the budget. Again, you might ask, why is that the case? I mean, regional differences in Italy are rather large. Why is fiscal equalization so small? On the other hand, the regional differences in Australia are not that large. Why is equalization still that large? Has it to do with the diversity in those countries? Is there something that prevents an Italian government to establish a huge equalization system that Australia has succeeded in establishing? What explains the differences? I mean, for one, you see one difference is between Australia and Canada. Both countries have very similar institutional backgrounds, except for fiscal federalism and equalization. Well, one delegate to our committee once said, both countries are equal, except that Canada has Quebec, and that explains everything. You might ask that question for other countries. Is there something like a diversity variable that explains that for Canada explains the relatively small equalization system, which is much larger in Australia? Is there something for other countries that explains, for instance, that Italy and Belgium and Spain have relatively small, or Italy and Belgium have relatively small equalization systems? A last point I want to let's highlight is a caution. I mean, usually we tend to think of a relationship between the more we have of something, the more we have of something else, like the more tax autonomy or the more diversity accommodation we need, the more tax autonomy probably a country has, or more in economics term, the higher the tax or spending autonomy, the higher the growth of a country. And we try to link them in a simple bivariate correlation. Now with intergovernmental fiscal relations, it's more complex. For long, economists thought that decentralization is a good thing for growth, until they realized that it much depends on context. For instance, on the quality of the institutions, both at the central and the local level. Institutions have to work. Trust, property rights, and all those institutional features of a country play an enormous role in the way decentralization works. And there is now a lot of research, especially from the World Bank, that says clearly decentralization only works or only has positive effects if the institutions at the state and local level are well established, if those institutions work. If they don't work, decentralization can even have a negative impact. And that's exactly what I'm trying to show here. This is about trade openness and decentralization. Decentralization works if a country is very open to the world, but it has actually negative consequences if it's not open to the world, if it's very closed. If I now put that to your question, to what extent can decentralization or other features of an intergovernmental fiscal framework, how can they affect or how can they accommodate diversity? You have to be very careful in setting the context. It might accommodate diversity. It might help reduce tensions within a country. It might to help somehow bring out the potential of growth in a country, but not necessarily. The context has to be right. Many other variables, many other context variables, many other institutional features of a country have to be right in order for intergovernmental fiscal frameworks, in order for equalization, in order for decentralization, in order for all these frameworks to deliver what they actually should deliver. This is where I stop, and I'm happy to answer your question if there are. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your presentation. We haven't decided if we make also the second presentation and then we collect all the questions. Maybe, yeah, I would do like that if to you it's fine. Unless there are, or I have some questions, but maybe we can collect all after the whole presentation. If I forgot to say that for the participant, for the attendees, if you want to pose questions to the speakers, you can write them in the Q&A chat, let's say, no, not in the chat, but in the Q&A tag. One more thing I forgot at the beginning is to excuse Greta Massa Gallerano, because he couldn't be here as a speaker. He was an invited speaker and he was supposed to present the Italian case, but for his very serious personal issues, he informed us yesterday that he couldn't be here. So allow me now to pass the floor to the second speaker of this morning. His name is Damien Piron, and he is assistant professor in public finance, law, and researcher on pensions at the UC of Louvain. What is to mention is that Piron has published extensively on public finance, and he has also several publications on intergovernmental financial relations in Belgium. And what I was struck from is the fact that he also published on fiscal federalism, financial relation in Belgium in the light of economic and health crisis. Damien Piron, I think that now the floor is yours for your presentation. And again, if you want already start writing the question for the first presentation in the Q&A, you can do it. So the floor is yours, please.
Okay, good morning, everybody. First question, but we are now used to it. Do you hear me properly? Is it okay? Okay, great. So let me turn into my presentation first by really thanking the organizer of this conference for inviting me to make this presentation on federalism and diversity accommodation in the specific case of Belgium. So we've just had a really broad overview. Let's now specifically zoom on the Belgian case, which is, to my eyes, always fascinating, but you'll tell me more about it within a few minutes. And I think that this research project on federalism and diversity accommodation is a highly relevant topic, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion later on. And I also find it really relevant given the fact that I am a political scientist by training, but teaching public finance law on specific financial issues. So I am really at some crossroads in this regard, and I find your way of dealing with it really relevant once again. So as you might not all be very familiar with the many intricacies of Belgium and especially its fiscal federalism model, what a pity, but let me first maybe briefly enumerate some key political information regarding the situation in my country as an introduction. This is, I think, important as no less than 6 constitutional reforms were adopted between 1970 and 2011, and they transformed Belgium from a unitary state into a fully fledged federal state. As you might know, Belgium is a very complex federation which shows many peculiarities and a lot of diversity as well. So Hansjörg stressed this beforehand, but one could say that fiscal decentralization in Belgium can be seen as a specific way of accommodating diversity. For those who might know Belgium federalism, forgive me in advance for oversimplifying a bit things, but for others, the basic conclusion that you will have to keep in mind is that if by the end of my talk you think you've understood Belgium, well, you probably haven't. That's at least something that we say here in Belgium about our own very small but very complex country as well. To give you an example, the first source of diversity is the coexistence of two types of federated entities covering distinct yet partially overlapping territories. We've got some communities, 3 communities and 3 regions. I won't go into too much detail here because it's not necessarily relevant and it's sometimes very complex, but just keep this first fact in mind, the coexistence of 2 types of federated entities. Secondly, the Belgian Federation is also structured around 2 main, let's call them poles, as a result of the linguistic divide between the Dutch speakers and the French speakers. And in this sense, the Dutch-speaking populations, which are called the Flemish, have historically developed a sense of being, let's say, undervalued by the French-speaking bourgeoisie in the 19th and early 20th century. Third, as we will see throughout this presentation, Belgium is also characterized by a deep economic cleavage between the northern part of the country, Flanders, which has built a much stronger economy and is therefore much richer than the southern part of the country, especially the Walloon region. This very specific situation has led to many conflicts regarding the organization of fiscal federalism in Belgium. Lastly, the Belgian Federation is really centrifugal as well, as an ever-growing body of competences is being devolved from the central, or as we know it today, the federal level, to the federated entities. So these were the broad consideration regarding diversity in Belgium, but let's now focus on public finance. And in this context, most state reforms were intended to meet pressing demands for greater financial autonomy, which particularly emerged from Flanders, so the richer part of Belgium. Through successive waves of state reforms, I think it's important to stress that Belgian communities and regions have now acquired significant political, legal, and financial authority. And according to Eurostat, federated states managed about 20% of the country's GDP in 2019, which represented almost 40% of the total resources collected by Belgian public authority. So that's highly significant, not only financially, but also politically and legally. And according to Eurostat, the federated entities' level of revenue is even the highest of the whole continent, placing Belgium well ahead of Spain and Germany, and well above the average of the European Union as well, which is only about 6% of GDP, so between 3 to 4 times less than in Belgium. I think these are really relevant information. From a legal perspective, the legal framework of Belgian fiscal federalism is enshrined in the Special Law of January 1989 on the financing of the communities and the region. So this is a really long title, and I will refer to this law afterwards as the Special Financing Law, or even the SFL. And the SFL sets the degree of financial and tax autonomy enjoyed by the components of the Belgian Federation, and it defines how financial resources are allocated, both vertically, that is between the federal government and the federated entities on the one hand, but also horizontally among the federated entities themselves. It therefore represents the cornerstone of Belgian fiscal federalism. And in this presentation, I will provide a historical overview of the federated entities' financial system in order to highlight the normative underpinnings of this really intricate legislation, as well as the way it intended to answer sometimes very conflicting political demands. So for the sake of simplification, the history of the Belgian model of fiscal federalism can be divided into three broad periods, which reflect three cumulative layers of legitimations that have been put forward by politicians and economists in order to justify further reforms of this ever-evolving construction. First, vertical financial autonomy since the first state reform of 1970. Second, horizontal fiscal responsibility since the third state reform of 1989. And third, finally, tax autonomy, especially since the fifth state reform of 2001. Initially, so during the first period, which lasted from 1970 to 1988, once again, these are really ideal types. It's much more subtle in practice, but it's just to give you some broad context. So in this first period, the devolution of competences and financial means was intended to respond to divergent cultural, linguistic, and also economic preferences and priorities throughout the country. So during this transition phase towards a genuine model of fiscal federalism, the newly created federated entities gradually received broad vertical financial autonomy, that is, the power to define their own expenditure autonomously. The communities and the regions were granted the authority to vote their own budget annually, as well as full autonomy in the allocation of their resources. Yet, these resources nevertheless remained heavily dependent on central grants. The Belgian constitutions, in theory, foresees a general taxing power to both the communities and the region. However, the scope of their autonomous taxing power has been strongly restricted in practice by a federal law which states that the federated entities are not allowed to levy taxes in matters that are already taxed by the federal government, which represents a lot of taxing matters and therefore really strictly reduces the level of tax autonomy of the communities and the regions. Throughout the 80s, various Flemish politicians and economists were willing to denounce the limited extent of the federated entities' taxing power. According to some of their calculations, the latter only amounted to 3% of the total revenues, which echoes also the former presentation, a situation which illustrated, according to them, the almost total dependence on the central government in this respect. A second period started in 1989. Since then, debates regarding the financial organization of the federal system have extended to the horizontal allocation of resources, that is, the way of sharing the resources allocated by the federal government among the federated entities. And this issue has led to a trade-off between financial responsibility on the one hand and solidarity on the other, which is, I think, highly relevant in today's discussion. The concept of financial responsibility refers to the idea that an entity should reap the fruits of its economic dynamism. It is portrayed as a fair return principle in Belgium, that is the reward for supposedly audacious economic and tax policies. And the expression of fair return elicits, of course, Margaret Thatcher's famous quote, "I want my money back." It means it is considered fair for an individual, but also a region, to receive an amount of expenditure equivalent to the payments it makes. Such discourse strongly resonates with the Flemish side of the country, as it gives a clear advantage to the northern part of the country. Indeed, the distribution method clearly favors entities whose residents are better off and hence contribute more to public revenue. So once again, it's the case of Flanders in Belgium. Yet, French-speaking politicians who represent less prosperous territories and citizens insist on their side for the need of adequate financial solidarity among the component units of the Belgian Federation. And the special financing law, which was adopted in 1989, paved the way to a genuine model of fiscal federalism in Belgium. The fact that internal financial relations are organized through a so-called special law adopted by a special majority is politically highly significant, because this legal tool was originally designed as a minority protection mechanism in the field of institutional matters. In practice, any amendment requires the support of a 2/3 majority in the Belgian House of Representatives and the Senate, but also of a majority in the two French and Dutch linguistic groups that compose them. So from a legal perspective, the special financing law can therefore be defined as a crucial component of Belgium's economic constitution. This law introduced two major financing mechanisms for the federated entities: federal grants from national tax incomes and the devolution of additional taxing power to the regions. Firstly, most competences transferred to the federated entities in the really important 1989 state reform were funded by annual grants paid out from the two main taxes collected by federal administration, that is the personal income tax, the PIT, and the value added tax, the VAT. These grants were distributed according to two distinct rationales. On the one hand, the competences devolved to the three regions were funded by PIT grants, and these PIT grants were allocated on the basis of their relative share in PIT revenue. So this is really the implementation of the fair return criterion. But the adverse consequences of this criterion on poorer regions, especially the Walloon region, later on the Brussels region, were partly compensated by an explicit equalization scheme. This mechanism, which is known as the National Solidarity Contribution, aimed to increase the resources of regions where the PAT revenue per capita was lower than the national average. We've seen just before that in practice, this mechanism is quite low in Belgium in comparison with other countries. So that was the funding logic of the regions. Let's now turn to the funding logic of the communities, which almost exclusively rested upon federal VAT and PIT grants. So the distribution of both grants was based on really distinct methods of calculation. And this might seem quite technical, but it's also politically significant. because the very important VAT grant, which was designed to fund education policy, absorbed no less than 80% of community expenditure at that time. So it was really the most important funding mechanism of communities. And it was not allocated through the fair return criterion, but according to the so-called financial needs of both communities, estimated on the basis on their pupil ratio. This noticeable derogation from the fair return principle has been depicted as an implicit solidarity mechanism between communities. It is justified politically by the argument that a Francophone child is worth just as much as a Flemish child. By contrast, the communities do not benefit from any explicit solidarity mechanism, as the latter has solely been provided for the regions. Secondly, the special financing law devolved additional taxing power to the regions, but not to the community. It partially transferred revenue-raising powers for several taxes to the regional authorities. The regions were, to some extent, back then, allowed to modify the basis, the tax rate, and also the exemptions from these so-called regional taxes. For quite complex reasons related to the specific case of Brussels, the two main communities were de facto devoid of such taxing autonomy. The entry into force of the special financing law subjected especially the French community to quite foreseeable financial distress. Its richer Flemish counterpart did not experience the same situation, also thanks to the merging of the Flemish regional and community institutions into one broad Flemish budget. So their financial resources have also been pooled. So at the request of the French-speaking political parties, two additional rounds of institutional reforms provided for a rather limited refinancing of federated entities in the 90s. And this brings me to the third period, and the fact that the fifth state reform, which was adopted in 2001, marked the transition to a third stage in the history of Belgian fiscal federalism and diversity accommodation. Since then, endeavors to improve public finance management have resulted in the transfer of increasing tax powers to the regions. The new revenue-raising powers are supposed to enable them to more effectively tie their resources to their policies, even though this situation also increases the likelihood of inter-regional tax competition. In financial terms, the fifth state reform was based on two main elements. The first was a new refunding of the communities in order to resolve the underfinancing of the French community. In addition, regional tax autonomy was increased. The regions received new tax instruments, while the prerogatives on regional taxes were also harmonized. As a result, regional governments now have complete jurisdiction over all regional taxes. Accordingly, they can autonomously set the basis of the rate of and the exemptions on these regional taxes. The fifth state reform also enabled the regions to collect what was called general surcharges and allow general reliefs on the PIT levied on their own territory, as well as to implement general reliefs and increases. However, such surcharges or reliefs could not exceed by then a margin which was set to a little bit less than 7%. So the autonomy on PIT was increased, but was also restricted to plus or minus 7%. Despite this important reform, the main Flemish political parties further advocated for greater regional tax autonomy throughout the noughties. They emphasized the need to strengthen the federated entities' responsibility. And this highly polysemic term is crucial in debates over the financing of the communities and the regions in Belgium. In such discourse, increasing the region's tax responsibilities by granting them direct access to part of the PIT is supposed to increase the political accountability of their representatives. When it comes to fiscal aspects, the responsibility principle supports amplified recourses to the fair return criterion to distribute financial means among the federated entities. Yet, one could rephrase the rhetorical question, who would not want to be responsible due to advocates of greater regional taxing powers, and ask instead who really has the means to exercise such responsibility. And in this sense, the issue at stake in the long-lasting conflict between the Flemish and the Francophones comes down to tracing the origins of the economic gap between Flanders and Wallonia. Does it stem from Francophone leaders' inappropriate choices, or is it rather the result of economic, social, historical, and demographic trends largely beyond their field of intervention? In October 2011, after no less than 18 months of negotiation, which is a world record you might probably have heard of, a new institutional agreement was made. The sixth state reform transfer competences worth more than 20 billion euros to the communities and the regions in areas such as family allowances, healthcare, the labor market, tax expenditures, and so on. When it came into force, the communities and regions' resources respectively increased by approximately 50% and 20%. So it's really a major reform in Belgium fiscal federalism. This broad devolution of competences went along with further decentralizing of taxing powers and increased regional tax autonomy. About a quarter of overall PIT revenue was transferred to the region. So it's a huge reform regarding tax autonomy. Yet the previous system of limited surcharges and reliefs on the PIT was replaced by a new system of so-called regional piggyback PIT. In practice, the regions currently levy extended surcharges, that's the official name, on the, in the meantime, reduced federal PIT. So the federal PIT was reduced in order to allow the region to levy extended surcharges on it. Additionally, the regions obtain exclusive taxing powers over a series of tax expenditures related to their own competences, such as property taxation. Yet, this widening of regional tax autonomy also creates some interference between federal tax policies and regional resources. Since the reduced federal PIT is the sole basis for the calculation of regional surcharges, federal PIT reforms directly affect the PIT surcharges actually collected by the regions, which is one of their main revenue items. Through this channel, federal decisions directly impact regional financial resources. In spite of these limits, which are really important, especially from a political perspective, the growing regionalization of the PIT nevertheless represents a noticeable step towards greater regional tax autonomy on top of the wide range of regional taxes. As a consequence, regional authorities are nowadays endowed with significant tools to consolidate their own tax system. So to conclude this historical overview of fiscal federalism in a country as divided as Belgium, one can say that in a similar way to its own institutional structure, Belgium's fiscal federalism framework is constantly evolving. Since 1989, its functioning has been enshrined in the special funding law, and this piece of legislation strikes a quite painstaking and temporary balance between two opposing trends regarding Belgium's institutional structure. While the Flemish political parties petition for further regional fiscal responsibility and tax autonomy, which is quite favorable and almost really favorable to Flanders, French-speaking officials on their end fiercely stand against any reform that is likely to impoverish the other components unit of the country, and especially the Walloon region and the French-speaking community. As states reforms have passed, Belgium's federated entities have acquired substantial budgetary resources, proportionally the highest in Europe. Meanwhile, the regions were also granted pronounced tax autonomy, and the sixth state reform greatly increased their capacity in this respect. Institutional reforms, therefore, appear to be key moments in diversity accommodation in Belgium. As talks and negotiations are supposed to start over a seventh state reform, I have no doubt that new and sometimes painful compromises are going to be needed in order to satisfy highly diverse preferences regarding the organization of fiscal federalism in Belgium in the near future. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Damien and Piron, for your very interesting presentation on the Belgian case that I would say that really fit in the general framework that Blöchliger presented in his presentation at the beginning, fiscal federalism and diversity accommodation. So among many cases, Belgium, I would say, is one of the best examples that fit in this large topic. I myself have some questions, but I would rather prefer if to pass the floor if there is no, I don't see any question yet in the Q&A. Maybe we can allow some time. I don't know if Francisco has also some question he wants to start. I start. Maybe you can start if you want.
Okay, thank you very much, Alice. Thank you very much to our two panelists for kindly accepting our invitation and for being here and for sharing these very interesting and insightful presentations. My first question would be, I have two questions actually for our first speakers, because I was struck by the decrease of importance of autonomy he showed, and the growing importance of co-determination in the decision-making processes because of the involvement of the second level in states' decision in fiscal matters. And I would like to know if there is a link in this finding with the nature of the integrated or disintegrated fiscal constitutions that he has also shown. Because sometimes we find that this very interesting cleavage between the institutional design on one hand and the political practice on the other hand. And for example, to put one of the examples, in Canada, we see this very centralized constitutional design that was designed in 1867, but then how the system has progressively evolved towards being one of the more decentralized in tax matters. And my second question would be if, from the data he presented, if there is if there are findings of if do federal countries value more solidarity than others, if that finding can be extracted. Because I was trying to see that two of the countries with bigger equalization programs were Japan and Korea, which are two centralized countries, of course, with very important, especially in the case of Japan, very important differences in terms of regional GDP. But I would also like to know if there are findings of why these two centralized countries, we also saw in the slides, if I remember correctly, the example of Sweden, why these countries that in principle, they don't have problems of territorial accommodation, we could say, they have very important and very strong equalization systems.
Before you answer, may I add a couple of questions that are related to what Francisco Romero Caro asked you? Is it fine with you? Yeah, because related to tax autonomy, my question is how you calculate it and why I ask you this, not in detail, but especially in the relation to co-determination. Because what is clear to me is that, for instance, if I say that the Bundesrat up in Germany approves all federal law in tax matters to the extent that the revenue from this tax matter flows in the budget of the lender. So this is a kind of co-determination. But I'm not sure how you count, for example, the Spanish case in which the autonomous communities have substantial legislative power on ceded taxes. Ceded taxes are the taxes set by the central government, and then the revenue is ceded to the autonomous communities. And on top of that, in relation to certain taxes, there are also substantial legislative powers. So does this power, as these can be exercised in an autonomous ways, flows in the tax autonomy indicators, or do they just flow in the co-determination, or they flow in both? So this is just a curiosity. And then another thing that struck me is that you addressed to fiscal constitution and classified them as integrated, quasi-decentralized, and decentralized, so as Francisco mentioned. But I wonder if you, first of all, what was for you included in fiscal constitution? So in a broad sense, so also intergovernmental agreement, because the substance prevail on the form. So it's a constitutional matter. So even if it's just an intergovernmental agreement, it counts. And then I wanted to know how you deal with the practice. So there is very frequently, especially in fiscal federalism, a wide gap between the lawing book, and so that letter of the constitution, and the practice, so system, how they function. And this goes especially together with the division of competences. This is an emblematic example of this deviation, and especially in financial issues. So I wonder how you put this in. We have so while you think about answering, I collect the question that is posed in the chat. And this is a question of Belgium, and in particular, one of the attendees would like to know how the special law is approved, and which is the procedure and the role of national government in the approval of the law, if any. And this goes back to the co-determination issues. And I have also a question on the Belgium case. So then we have collected most all, and you can, then the floor is again yours. For you, Damien, Piron, I would like to know, you mentioned regional taxes, and in this case you mentioned that substantially apart from exception from the, if I understood well, the power to set the tax, regions have full power. But I wonder if the case you mentioned of the surtax, of the surcharge on the PIT, is included in this, or there are any other relevant taxes that are included, because it's just the case where taxes are under the exclusive responsibility of the region, or if surtax surcharges counts as regional taxes. And if not, what is included? Is something relevant? It's something that has a role in changing the balance between fiscal centralization and decentralization or not? And another thing that was not completely clear to me, you maybe explained it, but I didn't fully get it, is when you mentioned the equalization. Sorry for this technical question, but it's very difficult to find information on the Belgian case. So now that we have you here, we take advantage of you. And because you mentioned the equalization mechanism, and you mentioned two taxes that are the basis for equalization. But it was not completely clear to me if these taxes are horizontally shared on the basis of the place of origin of the revenue, and then they are integrated by an equalization fund from the federal level, or if these taxes are collected together and a percentage of the total amount collected from these taxes is then distributed on equalization basis between regions. So this was not completely clear to me. So I do not have any other question. Francisco, are you happy? Okay. So I would pass the floor to the speakers for answering all these questions. Sorry for if too many.
Okay, so I'm supposed to answer first. Is that right? Okay. I will go through, but I see 4 questions. I will answer first the most easiest to explain what is the tax autonomy. The one I showed right at the beginning of a presentation. That's a very simple indicator. It's the, well, there is I've been 60 years old publication on tax revenues of OECD countries. I think it's one of the oldest OECD publications. It's dealing with what type of taxes and how much are collected in OECD countries. And this publication also details which level of government collects those taxes. So what we actually do is checking whether those taxes those taxes that go to the state and local governments, whether the state and local governments have actually some power to set tax rates over those taxes. For instance, the German tax sharing system, in the German tax sharing system, for instance, sharing the income tax and the VAT, that's not an autonomous tax of the states. So it does not go into the taxonomy I showed at the beginning. So what is shown on this first slide of the presentation is really the amount of taxes going to state and local governments, and over which those state and local governments have some power to set the tax rates, either full, like in the Swiss or Canadian case, or restricted by constitutional provisions, that, like in the Belgian case, where they have to be set within certain limits, or in the US case, where they have to respect some interstate competition legislation. So it's the degree of autonomy that is chosen when we talk about tax autonomy. The second question about co-determination. Again, the co-determination, it's a constitutional issue. It's co-determination, or the co-determination indicator is or reflects constitutional background, such as what is the power of the second chamber. I think almost every federation has a second chamber. So what is the power? What is the power of the second chamber to initiate legislation or to block legislation of government or the first chamber? What are collaboration bodies like conferences of the prime ministers of the states? What is the power of intergovernmental bodies like I think there is an Australian one. I think there is in many federations there are such type of bodies, but the Australian one is probably the most prominent one. It is called the Council of Intergovernmental, the Council of Australian Governments, which is an intergovernmental body that has some policy shaping power. I mean, it indeed, co-determination is a summary indicator that reflects all those bodies, institutions that deal with collaboration and coordination across levels of government, institutionally set either by the constitution or some special law, like in the Belgian case. The third question related to the size of equalization system, that is actually a really interesting question. You took the example of Korea and Japan, which have very strong equalization systems, but don't have very strong equalization, don't have very strong territorial disparities. You take the opposite case of Italy or even Belgium that was mentioned now, which has strong disparities but small equalization systems. That's exactly would be a point for research. There is a lot. There has been, I think, 20 years around, quite a lot of research on the size of welfare system and ethnic homogeneity in a country, saying that welfare systems are more established in homogeneous countries than in more heterogeneous countries, implying that people are more ready to pay for their own kin than for some strangers they don't really have a strong relationship with. And you can say the same. I mean, you could argue the same thing happens in a federation. In homogeneous, or in, let's say, in countries or in federations which are, let's say, ethnically less diverse, like Australia, people are more ready to equalize or to pay for the others, to somehow to equalize the needs of people which are very similar to what they think themselves. Why that might be less the case in federations which are very diverse. And I mean, the Belgian, I mean, Damien explained it very well. The Flemish and the Wallonian people, there is a strong antagonism between them. And probably that leads to the fact that they insist on their, what they call the juste retour, what is the fair return, rather than, okay, we need to have similar living conditions everywhere in the country. We need to equalize those needs, which, for instance, is much more established in the German constitution, which again is, more ethnically much more, or culturally much more homogeneous. So, to come back to that question of Korea and Japan, I mean, Korea and Japan are ethnically very, very homogeneous. And there is a strong desire in those societies to equalize territorially, maybe not individually, but territorially. And that explains the large, or probably explains, or potentially explains the large size of equalization in those two countries, and explains the smaller amount of equalization in countries which are more diverse. The last point, the difference between practice and law, I mean, that's a very fundamental question whenever you deal with institutional indicators, or whenever you establish, or whenever you try to quantify legislation, laws, constitutions. To what extent is the constitution really lived? Is it just a piece of paper, or is it something that is somehow deeply anchored in society and the population? We assumed that the let's say constitutional practice in those countries we were studying, in those 15 countries we were studying, at least roughly reflects the constitutional theory. So there is no really huge gap between what the constitution says and what is actually lived. And I think the Belgian case really shows that whenever there is let's say a strong tension between the constitutional background and what people actually want, that there will be constitutional reform that brings closer together constitutional legislation or constitutional law and the actual constitutional practice. That's all for at this stage from my side.
Thank you so much. Please.
Okay, so it's up to me now, and I'll start to answer once as well with the easiest question to answer, which is about the role of subnational governments in adopting or transforming the special financing law, as in theory, it's totally absent. So in theory, subnational governments or parliaments have no formal role in changing the constitution or special laws. So that's the first point. Yet, these are the same parties that represent citizens at both the federal and regional levels. So in Belgium, the coordination of public policies in general, and especially in this case of tax and fiscal policies, is ensured through parties, and this is really important. So since these are the same parties, this gives some possibility to kind of coordinate the role of regional and national parliaments on the issue, but not through, let's say, formal channels. Secondly, regarding the working on regional taxes, one could maybe make a distinction between three types of taxes. So the first one would refer to the full constitutional tax autonomy, which is granted to region by the Belgian constitution. And as I've tried to explain, this full constitutional autonomy or fiscal tax autonomy, sorry, is very much reduced by another constitutional provision, which kind of imposes federal supremacy over regional autonomy. So in this context, regions have the largest powers that you can imagine on creating new taxes, but since the federal level already occupies many matters, this is quite low in practice. So this is the first case. The largest autonomy, but rare cases. Let's summarize it so. The second case regards what we call regional taxes, which are taxes which were formally collected by the federal government, but which were gradually transferred to the regions during the consecutive state reforms. So in this context, these are not the regions that are at the origin, let's call it so, of the taxes, but these specific taxes were gradually transferred to the regions. And in such cases, there are about 12 so-called regional taxes in Belgium, on gambling, for example, on housing policy as well, and that kind of things. In such cases, regions have been more and more autonomous on setting the basis, but also the rate of such taxes, as well as the exemption. So the difference is that such taxes were progressively transferred from the federal government, but at the moment, regions are more or less fully autonomous on such taxes as well. The third case is that you mentioned regards the case on PAT and regional surcharges on PAT, and this is kind of a really specific example, because if we want to simplify the way it works, it's kind of a shared tax between the federal level and the regional level. And I've tried to show that the federal level still has some higher authority because it's still responsible for collecting this tax, and it also remains responsible for setting the base of this tax. and second, also because it collects over 3 quarters of its revenues, while regions are only competent for a quarter of its revenue. So it's quite a complex system, and if you have more detailed, specific questions, I would, of course, be happy to answer them, but I think that answers at least your question, which brings me to your last question regarding the working of the equalization scheme in Belgium. So the way it works in practice is that it works on a comparison between the share of PIT which is collected in each region and its share in the population. So if one collects more PIT than the average in the population, then one does not receive any compensation, but well, more PIT revenues. But if, as in the case in Wallonia and also of Brussels, the share of the PIT is lower than the share in the population, then 80% of the difference is compensated to this equalization mechanism. So I hope this answers your question, but if you have other questions, do not hesitate as well.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And so I had seen that there were actually 2 questions in the chat as well.
Yeah.
Yes, I was going precisely to read it to you, because we have another 2 questions by one of our colleagues. And the first question is if the process of decentralization in Belgium has shortened the gap between Flanders and Wallonia, or if, on the other hand, has increased it, and if this has led to a resentment from the French-speaking community towards the Flemish, because you mentioned of the different attitudes of the politicians. And if I may, abusing my role as moderator, I will add also another question, that it's what are the political views, I would say, of the 3 linguistic communities toward the equalization program? Do they advocate for reform, or and if so, in which direction? And we have another questions in chat by William Sanders that asks if Brussels is the 3rd region after Flanders and Wallonia. This is the difference between the regions and the linguistic communities, which is not very clear in Belgium.
Great, thanks. So to answer the first question in the chat, what we can say is that the difference, the economic gap between Flanders and Wallonia has not lowered. Stating whether it's the result of the decentralization mechanism, the special finance law, or many other factors is much more difficult. So I won't answer this, but one can witness, I do not have the precise figures here, but one can see that Flanders still lies ahead of Wallonia in terms of economic growth. So that's the first part of the question. The second was about possible resentment in the French-speaking population regarding the situation. And I will first say that it's a really good question, and that one could say that some part of the French-speaking population takes Flanders as responsible, and also Flemish politicians, as responsible for their own situation, also because they do not want to provide significant equalization between a region, while what could argue that the Walloon region and also the Brussels region arguably need some equalization, or at least would directly benefit from a more generous, let's say, equalization mechanism. And just to add something about it, in the Walloon or the French-speaking part of Belgium, one sometimes refer to earlier times in the late 19th century and early 20th century as well, when Wallonia was the motto of the Belgian economy. Okay, it's a long time ago, of course, but back then, Belgium and especially Wallonia was really strong from an economic perspective. Yet things changed dramatically after the Second World War, and the 60s are generally taken as the turning point in economic development in Belgium, with Flanders being on top of economic development. So one could say that there is some resentment, but also that Wallonia or the French-speaking also need the agreement of the Flemish part of the population to get more money. So that's a very complex issue. And regarding the specifically the equalization mechanism and the political views regarding it, it's important to stress that this mechanism was reformed in the sixth state reform. So the latest state reform has reformed this mechanism because especially the Flemish politicians thought it was too generous. So I took a picture of Hansjörg graph on the equalization schemes around the OECD, because it shows that it's far from being the case, but still in the Belgian political landscape, there is this idea that Flanders still contributes too much to the Walloon and Brussels situation. So the compensation, which I mentioned earlier, has been lowered and is now limited to 80% of the gap between the share of the PIT and the share of the population. So this was a huge stake of the earliest of the latest state negotiations.
There was also the question in chat about the three regions in.
Yes, sorry. To make things simple, there are in Belgium three communities which are based on language. So there are three official languages in Belgium, which are French, Dutch, and German. So we've got a German-speaking community, a French-speaking community, and a Dutch-speaking community. But the German-speaking community is really small. So in practice, one speaks about two main communities and one really smaller one. So this is for the communities, the linguistic communities, and we also have three territorial regions, which are Flanders in the northern part, Wallonia in the south, and Brussels kind of in the middle of Belgium, but not totally. So the Brussels regions lies on the territory of the Flemish region, which is also one of the main bones of contention in Belgium. But I think that's enough to answer your question. And they partly overlap as well. So as I wanted to stress earlier, for instance, the Flemish community and the Flemish region have more or less merged together, and some specific tools were used to do the same, but to a lesser extent in the southern part of the country between the French-speaking community and the Walloon region, but it's quite technical, so I won't get into much more detail.
Thank you very much, Damien, for answering all our questions. We have no more questions left, unless the speakers want to ask each other any question. And if that's not the case, I will just wrap up and then take our seminar, our first seminar, to an end. But before, I would like to remind you that this webinar series has two other seminars. One tomorrow at 9 a.m. Central European Summertime, and the final one on Friday at 5 p.m. again European Central Summertime. I would also, of course, would like to thank the speakers for being here with us, for sharing these very interesting and insightful presentations. And I will also remind that we plan to edit a book following this webinar series. So we are looking, of course, forward to having and reading your text, which I'm sure they will be very interesting and very useful, of course, for the work we develop here at the Institute of Comparative Federalism in Bolzano-Bozen in South Tyrol, in Italy. So thank you very much, Hansjörg and Damien, for being here with us today. And we are looking forward to keep in touch with you and to work with you together in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you also from my side.